My first documentary series was on the family history of my 4 grandparents. This series is about my grandparents' mothers. These 4 additional families make up the story of my 8 great-grandparents. This episode is on the family of Celia Holbird, the mother of my Grandpa Wood. I can trace 10 generations from my boys to the Holbird immigrant who sailed to the colonies from Europe. The spelling of the Halbert name changed over the years. This was especially common among German immigrants. Peter Halbert was my 6th great-grandfather. He was born about 1720 in Württemberg, Germany, a duchy of the Holy Roman Empire. War between Protestant and Catholic states in this area had devastated the entire region with famine and disease and made battlefields of villages and towns. Lack of religious freedom would drive many to flee their homes by the end of the century.
In 1751, Peter became a Palatine immigrant, joining other Protestants heading for the New World. Peter would have traveled first to Holland via the Rhine River, a trip of 6 weeks, then waited in Amsterdam for favorable weather before sailing on to Rotterdam.
Peter set sail that summer with 255 other German passengers on board the ship Patience. As usual, Captain Steele and his crew of 15 made a brief stop at the port of Cowes on the Isle of Wight to provision before beginning the transatlantic journey of 2 to 3 months. On September 9, 1751, the Patience arrived in Philadelphia. 30-year-old Peter would make the Pennsylvania colony his home for the next 10 years.
His wife's name was Anna Maria, a common German name. They likely married in Germany, and they probably arrived in the colony with some kids.
We only have records of 2 children, a son, Nicholas, and a daughter, Margaret Clora, baptized during November 1763 in York County, Pennsylvania. Nicholas was my 5th great-grandfather. We don't know much about Nicholas. He changes the spelling of Halbert and marries Catherine Zemet. Nicholas and his parents moved to Shenandoah County, Virginia by 1765. Here, he and Catherine have 3 kids and prosper for 2 decades. Nicholas's mother, Anna Maria, dies during these years, and in the fall of 1786, Nicholas fell very ill. He makes a will. In it, he divides his plantation between Catherine and their 3 kids. He mentions his father Peter, who is remarried and will continue living on the plantation.
Nicholas did not sign his name, but made his mark on the will.
Nicholas is probably in his late 40s when he dies early the next year in 1787. His father Peter dies shortly after. John Halbert was my 4th great-grandfather. He was born 1765 in Shenandoah County, Virginia. He also changed the spelling of his surname.
He marries Sarah Steele, the daughter of a Revolutionary War soldier, on January 16, 1792, in Amherst County, Virginia.
John and Sarah have 8 children, all born in North Carolina. The 1800 census is the first to include a Holbird ancestor. John and Sarah live in Rutherford County, North Carolina. We see them here again in the 1810 census and again in 1820. John bought 50 acres of land in 1804, and in 1812 he purchases another 150 acres. Like his father, John also makes a will that includes his wife's name and all 8 of their children. John passed away before the 1830 census, and Sarah is listed as a widow in both the 1840 and the 1850 census. James Jerome Bonaparte Halbert was my third great-grandfather. He was born October 26, 1806. Like his father and grandfather, he spelled his name different than their German grandfather. By the time he was 20, Jerome Bonaparte, as his father called him, started making his way west.
In 1826, Jerome was in Habersham County, Georgia, where he marries Elizabeth Ashley on February the 12th.
Jerome and Elizabeth have their first child in South Carolina, then 2 more in Mississippi. In 1836, they moved to the brand new Republic of Texas, stay for 30 years, and have 5 more children, making the tally 7 girls and 1 boy. The Texas State Archives lists Jerome as selling corn to the Texas militia in 1838. Jerome had a plantation, and many in the area owned slaves, but the Holbird family did not.
Jerome was listed in the Titus County Census in 1850 and 1860. Their only son, James, grew up helping his dad farm. When the Civil War comes along, James joined the Confederacy.
James Jasper Holbird was my great-great-grandfather. He was born October 4th, 1840, at Mount Pleasant, Texas. On February 20th, 1862, James enlists for 3 years as a private in Company A, 22nd Regiment, Texas Infantry. This muster document shows our current spelling of Holbird for the first time. James served with the 22nd Regiment for the duration of the war, mostly in Louisiana and Arkansas. James returns home to Texas at the end of the war and marries Sarah Frances Price from Arkansas. The Price family moved to Texas looking for some peace during the post-war turmoil in Arkansas. Cousin Edgar Wood said Sarah owned quite a bit of land near Marshall, Texas, probably inherited from her mother's family, and just 50 miles from the Holbirds' hometown of Mount Pleasant. We don't know for sure how James and Sarah met, but for those familiar with the Wood family folklore, you'll remember Uncle Jimmy telling the story of Wiley Winfield Scott Wood meeting James on the battlefield where they were both wounded. Well, Wiley knew Sarah before he met James. Wiley and Sarah grew up together as kids before the war in Arkansas. The Wood and Price families both lived in Washington County during the 1850s. The Woods also moved to Texas for a while after the war.
Whether it was geography that brought Sarah and James together, or an introduction by their mutual friend Wiley, the Woods and Holbards would be neighbors most of their lives and eventually in-laws.
James and Sarah stayed in Texas long enough to have 2 children. Then as things began to calm down in Arkansas, they considered returning. Sarah's father had bought land in Scott County before the war and was ready to return. James said, "Let's all go," and he buys 40 acres for $900. His parents, Jerome and Elizabeth, buy 40 acres close by in Polk County. Within a few years, Wiley Wood also returns to Arkansas and settles within a stone's throw of these 3 families. By the mid-1870s, both James and Wiley have 160-acre homesteads in Scott County.
James and Sarah have 7 more children over the next 11 years, all born in Scott County.
They all appear here in the census lists of 1870, 1880, 1900, and 1910. James' mother Elizabeth dies in 1877. She was 67. Jerome remarries and in 1883 adds 120 acres to his homestead. He dies a few years later on his farm, 77 years old. The location of their graves is unknown.
In 1887, James is appointed postmaster of a new community called Gate, close to the homestead. Sarah took over as postmaster a few years later.
In 1901, after nearly 50 years of friendship, James Holbird, the former rebel soldier, and Wiley Wood, the former Union officer, attend the wedding of their children, Celia and John. The couple will remain married for 60 years. By 1909, James and Sarah are alone on their farm. All the kids have married and have places of their own. Same for the Woods next door, and Wiley dies at the end of this year. Soon after, John and Celia decide to try the new state of Oklahoma, where John had spent years before as a surveyor. James and Sarah decide to join them, and they list their homestead for sale in December 1911.
In February 1912, the Wood and Holbird families make the move to Red Oak, Oklahoma. John and his son Seth drive their cattle and teams overland, while the parents, the ladies, and the younger children travel by train.
Everyone is on the 1920 census of Latimer County, Oklahoma. Sarah died on September 28, 1921. She was 82. James died October 15, 1925, at his daughter Mary's home in Wilburton. He was 86 years old and was buried with Sarah at Center Point Cemetery.
Foster married but never had children. He moved to Indian Territory before statehood, where he lived the rest of his life.
Charles Price had 6 children and lived to be 85 years old. He lived in Tulsa and Shawnee.
Mary Rosanna Elizabeth married into the Mills family and had 11 children. They came to Oklahoma in 1912 with her parents and lived out their days in Wilburton.
Amanda lived only 9 years.
James Pleasant, only 16 years.
1-year-old Leela died in 1877.
And Thomas died at only 2 years old.
Loving Booker, the youngest of the 9 kids, lived to be 88. He had 4 boys and ran a feed store in Ada, where he passed away in 1969. Celia Frances Holbird was my great-grandmother. She had 7 children and lived to be 90. It was her 3rd great-grandfather Peter who left Germany for Philadelphia 120 years before her birth, making her the 5th generation of Holbirds in America. 269 years later, there are still Holberts from our line living in Oklahoma and Arkansas.